Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am at Bateman's, which was the country home of Rudyard Kipling. I've already filmed his London home, which is very close to Charing Cross Station. So Rudyard Kipling was the Bard of Empire, as it's well known. He did so much to blazon forth the supposed glories of the British Empire. He's very much fallen out of fashion, and indeed he's one of the few British literary figures who was not born in the United Kingdom or indeed Ireland, when obviously we weren't always part of the UK, most of us not part of the UK anymore. He was born in India, so he was born in Mumbai in 1865, and his father Lockwood was a professor of drawing at an art school there in Mumbai, or Bombay as it was known in those days. So Kipling's family came from the English Midlands. They were middle class, and Kipling's first cousin, Stanley Baldwin, they had the money in the family, and Baldwin, he later became Prime Minister. So Kipling expressed his envy of Stanley Baldwin, who got to go to Harrow and then Trinity College, Cambridge. So Harrow being one of the grandest schools in the Empire at the time, and Cambridge University, obviously one of the most remarkable universities in the world, certainly those days, probably second best ever. Within Cambridge, Trinity being a college of really unparalleled stature. But Kipling, his family finances wouldn't extend to that, so he left school in his mid-teens. This was common in those days. He's lucky to go to school even as long as that. Of course, bearing in mind in India, many people didn't go to school at all until well into the 20th century. So he was born in Bombay. He came back to the United Kingdom as a child. He returned to India in his teens, and that was what really captured his imagination. Anyway, then he returned to India and he became a newspaper editor at the age of 17. He spent a lot of time in Lahore, and there was a famous canon there called the Zam, which features in his stories Kim. Kim is about this child who's a spy in favour of the British Raj. So he was someone of the most exceptional literary talent, and he had a very great word hoard. He could speak passable Hindi, or Hindustani, as we used to call it in those days. So he began publishing all sorts. He published poesy. He composed a couple of plays, not that well regarded, though, and lots of novels. So he's best known as a writer of fiction, and indeed children's literature as well. The Jungle Book is perhaps the most celebrated of his works for children, and the Jungle Book is set in India, and they're animals. They're not quite clothed beasts, because although they speak, they don't behave as humans do, and their names are simply the Hindi names of them, like Balu, Bagheera, Sher Khan, and so forth, and Kaa. Anyway, so because some people I know who've been to India and heard people speaking about animals say, "What? I recognise that one from the Jungle Book," but I know some Indian children consider them to be Indian stories. And it's not the Hollywood cartoon from the 60s, which I grew up on and I thought was magnificent. That's not very faithful to Kipling at all, actually. The story is a bit more demanding, although it is suitable for children, way more intricate, much longer, not always uplifting. It's got sort of darker sides to it as well. So Kipling, he had flirted with anti-imperialism, but by the time he was in his 30s, had become a passionate believer in the British Empire, which was then at its apogee. And he was also an outspoken supporter of the Conservative Party. Anyway, so he made an awful lot of money. He married an American lady when he was in his 30s, and their eldest son, John, was born in 1897. So we'll see. Oh, okay. So very exciting. Take us back in time to this bygone era of Kipling. And they went on a round-the-world honeymoon. They spent some time in Japan, and they lived in the United States for a few years. And his eldest son, John, I think was actually born in the United States, his eldest child, and they had two more children, a daughter, well, two more daughters, one of whom died in infancy, and there was Elsie, his daughter, who lived to a great age. Anyway, so they came back to the United Kingdom, and he was very rich. He was world famous, perhaps the most popular writer in the Anglosphere at the time. So he had a following in the United States, not as great as you might think, because often he was writing about specifically British themes, or really a tub thumping for British imperialism, which wasn't always popular in the United States. But when the United States conquered the Philippines, having booted out the Spaniards, that's when he wrote about the white man's burden. I can't quote it properly, but saying, you know, send forth the best ye breed, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease, and then fight these savage wars of peace, and so on, for our new court folk and wild, half devil, half child. So you can see why Kipling is not flavour of the month these days, because some of his views would be regarded as rebarbative by many. His comments on race were certainly abrasive, like he said he found it galling to see a brown-legged son of the East in M.A. robes. So you could think that he was a fantastic writer and still find his views on race to be nauseating. Anyway, what else are going to say? So yes, that thing of white man's burden, a lot of people don't realise this, that is actually a pie-hand to American imperialism, not British imperialism. He simply took it as read that whites ruling non-white peoples was desirable and was better for the non-white races, which was not an uncommon viewpoint in the white world at the time. And obviously through the 20th century, that has been widely criticised and rejected. He also wrote Recessional about 1900, when the United Kingdom was really at the pinnacle of its might and prestige. But Recessional, that sort of going backwards, saying, spare us yet, thinking that perhaps the United Kingdom was overstretched because it held dominion over palm and pine, as in where there are palm trees, which would be like the tropics, and where there are pine trees, places like, say, Canada, because they might be drunk with the sight of power, but so it might all be one with Nineveh and Tyre, as in two ancient cities that were famously razed to the ground. It could all pass away, and of course, just beyond Kipling's lifetime, that's precisely what happened. So had to be a bit humble, and a contrite heart was the thing where they really had to offer up. But there was no contrition for terrible wrongdoing by British imperialism on behalf of Rudyard Kipling. He's the only Rudyard I've ever heard of. And those Mr. Kipling cakes they were always advertising in the 1990s. I don't know if they're anything to do with Rudyard. So what else is worth mentioning about him? Yeah, he wrote these barrack room ballads about soldiers serving in India, the 3 British soldiers, and which 3 parts of the United Kingdom did he choose to represent the United Kingdom? Well, there's a Cockney, there's a Yorkshireman, and there's an Irishman. You might have expected a Scot, but no, or a Welshman, or, I don't know, someone from the West Country, but no, Irish. So he was very much against Home Rule for Ireland, and he published a poem entitled Ulster 1912. And what was he saying? That it mustn't be allowed, one law, one king, one crown. That's the refrain to it. If England drive us forth, we shall not fall alone. Because he's saying if Ulster has to be part of a Home Rule Ireland, then that will also mean calamity for England too. And he said that they suggested that the Ulster Protestants were hated by the Catholics in the rest of Ireland, which was largely untrue. I mean, I know there was some sectarianism. We mustn't overstate this. It's, again, hard to remember just how calm, relatively, Ireland was in 1912. I know that the UVF was founded the following year, but there hadn't been a single sectarian killing in Ireland for over 20 years. I mean, prior to that, in the late 19th century, the Orange Parades in the north, yes, there were sometimes fisticuffs, but people were very rarely killed. I realise it became a great deal worse afterwards. So it was fairly tranquil, considering. Anything else about him? Well, so he was a very wealthy man. He, when he was 36, he was making £5,000 a year. Bear in mind, a middle-class salary is about £100 a year. Fees for Eton were about £170 a year. So he was affluent, and that's why he purchased this place, Bateman's, which I think was named after a local tax collector who built it in 1634. We're in the fair shire of Kent, so the very southeast corner of England, with all these landscape gardens and woods. So he was an absolutely adoring father, but He was an ardent imperialist, a believer in military preparedness. He called for compulsory military service even in peacetime. That was a conservative talking point. The Liberals were in office at the time, and he said that they were too wishy-washy. They weren't spending enough on defence. Some of the Anglo-German naval race, the Royal Navy, needed to be built up, maintain double power standard. That's to say, according to the Naval Defence Act, the Royal Navy had to be bigger than the second largest, but thus the third largest navy in the world combined. The idea being, in case those two formed an alliance, the Royal Navy would have the numbers to sink its foes. Why not bigger than the second, third, and fourth biggest navies put together? Well, there was obviously had to be some sort of financial sanity that was just unaffordable. And his son John went to Wellington College, one of Britain's most estimable schools, founded in 1852, named in honour of the Duke of Wellington, founded just after he died. Prince Albert's idea for the sons of army officers. Now, you didn't have to be a son of the army officer by the time the 20th century rolled around, but it had strong links with the army. Well into the 20th century, got more Victoria Crosses than any other school. So his son, John, went there. But John's trouble is he was severely myopic. Without his glasses, he was as blind as a bat. And then he left school at the age of 17. And his father was going around the country orating and saying that we must build up the armed forces. Germany is a mortal peril. There was this sort of craze about the threat of invasion. There was a lot of Germanophobia at the time, but there was some Germanophilia too, especially those who were into philosophy or into classical music, had a great deal of admiration. People like Houston Stewart Chamberlain of Britain, who became a naturalised German. Those thought that Germany was a more natural ally, that France and Russia, Germany's probable nemeses, were also foes of the United Kingdom, as they had been on many occasions. Remember, Germany only come into existence in 1871. Well, Germany a bit of an upstart nation, so far as some thought. But anyway, war was declared, and he was desperate to get his son into the armed forces. The Royal Navy turned John down on the grounds of his poor eyesight, and then the British Army refused him as well. So Kipling went to his old friend, Lord Roberts, Lord Roberts of Kandahar, who'd led that campaign in Afghanistan in, when was it, 1879, the only one successful in the Anglo-Afghan wars. So he was very frail at that stage and just died a couple of months later. And just weeks into the First World War, in Bobbity, he pulled strings and he had Kipling's son John accepted into the Irish Guards, despite this boy being scarcely able to see. So he was then commissioned into the Irish Guards, obviously rushed through their officer training. I don't know if went to Sandhurst or not, and then put in charge of a platoon. To be in the Irish Guards, you don't actually have to be Irish at all, as in John Kipling was not. But anyway, famously, he went to fight the Battle of Loos in Belgium, and he was killed just after his 18th birthday. He'd been fighting at the front at the age of 17, which wasn't allowed without special parental permission, which was granted. Remember, he was legally a minor until 21 in those days, but you could still get killed. Well, he went missing, first of all. They presumed him to be wounded because the fog of war, there was so much confusion. His parents were aghast. They were racked by guilt. His mother hadn't been quite so keen on him signing up. He's tried and tried, even rejected twice. Only with some extraordinary special dispensation was this young man accepted into the army. And because in war, obviously, your glasses can easily fall off. You're running, you slip over, there are explosions, you're thrown up in the air, you land wherever, and then he's helpless, as that's what indeed happened. But they first of all didn't think he was dead, or wouldn't accept this. Went around, looked through thousands of photos provided by the Red Cross, thousands of prisoners of war who were prisoners of the German. No, they couldn't find him, going through that with microscope, then not microscope, what's it called? This thing. My Lexus is deserting me. Magnifying glass. And they went out, they toured various hospitals, because there were some men who had a bump on the head, lost their memory, didn't know who they were, and for a year and a half they went through trying to find these young men. Was that him? For once they thought they'd found him, but no, it wasn't him. It was some other young man who lost his mind because of the horrors of war and a brain injury. So they interviewed all these soldiers who'd been in his unit, and they finally accepted that he was dead. So people claim to have found John Kipling's body because he was missing, presumed dead. There were lots of graves of soldiers they couldn't identify. They could sometimes tell the army by the uniform, even the rank. So they did find a lieutenant of the Irish Guards and buried him. And then in 1992 it was decided that was John Kipling. but subsequently this is found to be almost certainly not John Kipling, because John Kipling was a second lieutenant, not a lieutenant when he died. The uniform would be slightly different. Moreover, that corpse was found about 3 miles from where it's thought that John Kipling was dead, was killed. They could of course exhume the corpse and do some DNA comparison. So that was it. So it was a very bitter blow to him. So he remained an ardent supporter of the war, rather jingoistic to the end, but he was aghast with the gross incompetence, with the way lives were just squandered, with the way that the war industry just wasn't up to it. There was the shell crisis, the great majority of shells being duds, and so it could have been fought much more effectually. Bear in mind, he had no military experience at all, and he put his literary talents at the disposal of the government to propagandize for the cause. So he was writing articles in furtherance of pro-war activism. Anyway, so he was never quite the same again after that. He did write the official regimental history of the Irish Guards. He died in 1936, 18th of January, 2 days before George V. To whom he was very close. He used to drive from here to Windsor Castle, could make it in just under 3 hours. And someone said that the King's trumpeter had gone before, as in he was heralding George V. I'm surprised that he didn't actually ask the King to grant extraordinary permission for his son to be commissioned, but perhaps he felt that would be sort of abusing his close relationship with the monarch. So he's buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. So that's just a little bit about Rudyard Kipling. So he had one daughter who lived on, Elsie, who bought a big house at Wimpole in Cambridgeshire, but she never had children. That's all.